Welcome back to A Bite from the Money Sandwich, where we provide practical and easy to understand tips and ideas on how to manage your money better, so as to let you retire with comfort and on your own terms. Is your super really set up to pay you an income in retirement, or is it just sitting there as a savings account? Today, I'm joined by Adrian Gervasoni, who is Executive Manager of Advice Services at Industry Fund Services, also known as IFS, about how Australians approaching retirement should be thinking differently about their super. Adrian explains why super needs to shift from simply growing savings to delivering a reliable income, and how making retirement choices clearer and simpler can help people feel more confident about their future. We also talk about the IFS's white paper, developed in collaboration with Challenger to help align financial strategies with real lifestyle goals. Well, thank you, Adrian, for being here today on our show.
Thanks, Mark. Pleasure to be here.
Well, when I read your white paper, and it really well done to yourself, IFS and Challenger for this white paper. And this is now off the back of, we just finished our first Retirement, Leisure and Health Expo. And a lot of the questions people were doing, we're not coming up and asking about their portfolios, how it was invested. It was, will we ever be able to retire? The anxiety around pre-retirees about retirement, a lot of it founded, but a lot of it was just they just don't know what they don't know. A lot of this is between the ears, and it's just so good that your white paper is all about the behaviors, the emotions, and I do see this as a great step forward or in the right direction. But just so from your own personal view, or IFS and Challenger's point of view, why did you see there was a need for this white paper, or what inspired you to take on this white paper?
As you probably well know, we work with around about a dozen super funds. Some have spent the time and members' money on developing retirement products with their longevity products, but those that haven't have them on their roadmap somewhere. And as the financial advice licensing business that stands behind the advice that many funds provide, our job at a minimum is to consider, well, how will these products fit as part of an advice proposition? But, what was happening is that Challenger and I would often be at the same conferences. Many instances we're on the same panels talking about this unsolvable problem of how do we better prepare fund members for retirement? How do we give them the confidence to spend when they are in retirement? And at least to us, to Challenger and IFS, there was we thought some pretty obvious things missing. Now, one of them is that the starting point for many fund members, or any Australian really, thinking about retirement or retirement starting to become a bit more real for them, is what to do with the money that's been accumulating. And for us, or at least for me, that seems like a weird starting point in that we don't have this automatic understanding that super is about the wage you get when you retire. And so I think what's happened is we've spent so much time musing over what's the right product mix and to what extent do we protect someone for their whole life versus a life expectancy and all these things. It's all important work that the actuaries spend their time doing, but the starting position is so low in that for most fund members, their relationship with their super fund, if I can call it that, is that they might still get that statement. Hopefully not in paper form anymore, but there's still a bit of that happening. At a minimum, it gets emailed to you or a link to log in. You might log in twice a year. And what do you see? You see a lump sum. And so that anchoring to super being a savings account of which you have to make a decision on at some point, that really struck us as a part of the problem, is that we need to reframe super as being an income. But then, of course, let's say we do a good job of getting funds more confident with presenting themselves and super as an income in retirement. Then we've got to account for if there is more than one retirement product on offer by any one fund, let's not just throw a menu at members and hope for the best. And importantly for the advisors, be it those employed by a super fund or obviously Challenger works across a number of advice businesses and licensees, how do they better support the advisors that use their product, but think about it as a proposition, a true proposition where you're accounting for product and service together. It's something that we consciously put in front of consumers that best strikes this balance between enough choice that you give someone agency, but also there is this role for paternalism, decisions that we make, risk that we can take on, so that we don't paralyze someone with decisions. We present them with the few choices that will make a difference.
And I think you said it's also about educating advisors as well, and we will get onto that because it's, to me, with my background as an ex-advisor, I think that's really important because advisors have their own view of how people should retire or what their role is, and it could be so much more as a support for the potential person who's retiring. So when you were just saying about that we need to help members when they see this savings, this pool of funds, and just the behaviors that they have it's now time to retire, but there's sometimes people are just saying, "I don't really wanna touch it because if I start touching it and drawing down on it, it might run out before I do," and so
Um,
there's all these behaviors that is part of the education, and it can be so much better, what your white paper is talking about.
yeah, yeah. And then look, I think that anchoring or the bias to preserving capital in part is an issue that we are perpetuating or maybe the root cause of. As I said, if you present yourself as a lump sum, as a savings account, there is naturally going to be this view that you have to protect that number at retirement and beyond. And I mean, I myself started in this space as an advisor and I worked for a defined benefit fund. And I still go back to, whilst the internal rate of return calculation, what have you, means that defined benefit often were very attractive. But for the nurses and teachers that I would provide advice to, I would say very few of them probably understood what the internal rate of return was compared to a market-based product. But what the difference was is from the moment they joined their employer, in the case I was advising people working in a public health system, they were presented with a retirement income, a fortnightly amount they could expect when they retired. And for at least the schemes I worked with, there was a lump sum cash out option. But very few people wanted that. They loved the certainty of that income. So, whilst we can't necessarily replicate the defined benefit construct, we can kind of look to cues for why was it that workers who didn't go through the equivalent of a master's in financial planning seemingly were able to navigate a couple of choices at retirement, being lump sum or income for life, and could make a decision with confidence, knowing that there was a trade off, that yes, I could take that lump sum and do something with it, but my super was about the income after I stopped working. And so that's always stayed with me. And I still recall some clients that mulled over that. And why? Because they're in poor health. And that's the stuff that I think we've lost sight of, is that we're so driven by what makes people different from one another that we don't end up making any decisions on what's good for almost anyone. And dealing with outliers, I think, becomes more achievable when you have a solid understanding of but what's defendable, what's good, that you would advise your own family members and feel good and comfortable about that. And so that's the thing that I'm really hoping that this paper encourages others to think about, is you need to start with what does an acceptable, ideally great outcome, but it can't be perfect. If you're striving for perfect, you'll be paralyzed yourself, not making any decisions. And so, okay, we're striving for everyone to be paid an income when they retire. And part of that is to present retirement projection during someone's working life, not just because they need to know that number at some point, but because over a 20, 30, 40-year working life, presenting a projected income figure by itself will give consumers the confidence to spend their capital because they won't be thinking that way about it.
And I think when you're saying about having that confidence in retirement, is it all because you just want to get on. Retirement's never just about the money. It's all the good things that you can then spend your
Spot
time on, but you just want that confidence that you're going to have the money that's going to be there, even to the sort of the minute detail in that, well, I used to get paid as a salary monthly on the first of every month. Can I have my income stream pay me when I retire on the first of the
Yes.
month? So I've got that consistency. And when they find out, absolutely, that can be done, that you can just see the relaxation in their shoulders, the stress level drop for something as simple as that, but they just don't realize.
You're spot on. And I think, again, looking about learned behaviors for someone that is facing into retirement, whilst you're always at risk of losing a job and those sorts of things, but you've got a reasonably high degree of certainty about the next paycheck that's coming. And you don't have something like market volatility entering your thought process when it comes to employment income. Yet again, our industry's seemingly been accepting of the fact that market volatility will be part of someone's thinking about retirement income. And for me, that just is, it's a bit weird that there are the mechanisms in place to remove some of this uncertainty, or at least some of it. But it comes down to, are we prepared to take the risk on behalf of a member, a consumer, to limit some of that choice and lead with, I mean, the term sensible defaults, soft defaults, they get thrown around within industry. That doesn't mean much for a consumer. My thought is, what's the first picture you present someone? If you're starting with a 40-page questionnaire and you're asking random questions like, how long are you going to live? What income do you need? That, in my experience, very few people have neat, accurate answers for. And it's not their fault. It's ours. It's our service model that has not been consciously designed for someone who doesn't think like us. And I say us, the weirdos that work in the superannuation and the financial planning industry. So I think it's about changing the service model as much about product design, because what we need to start with is a picture. Marc, you're on track to get X. And without knowing much more about you, we might say half of the income we pay you, you should have some guarantee around, right? Now you've got to start somewhere, and there'll be a bunch of noises, and often it's the actuaries that pick on them, but we'll say, but hang on, that's going to be wrong more often than it's right. The starting position is that members kind of arrive at retirement, often without any conscious planning. There's still not enough access to advice, and they're presented with this lump sum, maybe a product menu, a bit of research they've done on Reddit, Facebook groups, but there's no starting picture often that they're working with. And I think that, again, in this paper, it's around choice framing, ideally limiting the number of choices between 3 and 5. And as I said, it's not so much even what my view is, because I run out of capability in this space as well. And that's why we brought in people like Dan and a few others who might not be necessarily deeply involved in financial product design and manufacturing, but importantly, they understand how consumers think and how they make decisions.
And Dan Gill's behavioral scientist on your white paper.
Thanks very much.
So just on that then, and as you're sort of saying, there are a million choices when it comes to, if you start going into the products, the options and all those sort of things, and you're saying, and this is where I do see advisors play an important role, is to understand their client, and so that they can simplify it down to 3 to 5 choices. That's what people actually want. No one wants 10 choices. They want 3 to 5 options at the most. So we're going down this path of not so much the numbers or the detail, but the behaviors. A part of your white paper talks about who's happiest. It doesn't have, you said, never it's going to be perfect, but you're happier if you're now retired than pre-retired, because you don't have the anxiety and you know what retirement looks like. You're happy if you get advice compared to not getting advised. So how much was behavioral science was so important for this part of this white paper?
Look, we did our best to leave our own biases at the door. And I mean, I'm someone who enjoys hearing my own opinions. So I've got to account for that when you're doing this sort of work as well. But we did some work on risk profiling a couple of years ago. As much as that might not be a topic that excites too many people, but it is the kind of the foundation on which most retirement work relies upon. That there's this initial question set that financial planners will kind of have wandered through for probably for decades without too much challenging of it. And it was because we were doing some work in digital advice that we were asked to present our question set, our risk profiling question set.
Right.
And for whatever the reason was at the time, myself, there's a head of risk and compliance here, we just didn't feel confident that without a planner there guiding that process, that these are really weird questions to be asking someone who might be for the first time going through an advice interaction. And so we went and we approached someone by the name of Simon Russell from Behavioral Finance Australia. And with the view of just, sense checking, have we got risk profiling wrong? And he'd written a book on risk profiling. And it was one of those things where, well, if you want to open the box on it, then yes, you've got it completely upside down. And so what we did was, instead, we built a choice experience where we asked, what we have now as a tool that we make available to our super fund clients, and the advisors use this now too, is it starts with asking, in our case, a super fund member, of one of 5 options, which is described to you, which best reflects what your preferences are. And so there's this play on, we test for what if type scenarios, what if the market fell 30% and blah, blah, blah. But the idea being, we first ask you to make a choice based on a description. And then we back test that choice with some challenge questions. And you can stay in this loop until the point you feel confident. Now, it's not, no model's perfect, but why we feel much more confident about that is, one, we force you to watch a 30-second video before you make any choice. So we can be certain about, do you understand when we ask you to make this choice, as much as we've tried to remove all the jargon possible, ultimately you're going to need to know a little bit about risk and return and how they play off each other. And that the time value of money does a role. There is this thing called inflation. So at a minimum, you need some return just to maintain $1 today to make it worth $1 tomorrow. And so, but there wasn't a million things that's what struck us. There wasn't a lot of things that we needed to be certain that every person going through this experience needs to understand. But ultimately, that way of determining someone's risk profile, that very much drove our approach to this problem of how do we help someone make a decision around retirement products? In that you've got these drivers, you've got a trade-off. And in the past, what our perception or view of best is, being best possible income, we've got to be clear, maybe that's not what everyone wants. Now, but if you ask it in this way, Mark, do you want the best income possible? You're always going to get a yes, right? So you have to ask that question or get someone's preferences where you have accounted for trade-offs. And that's hopefully shining through in this paper a little bit, is that best income possible is not the best scenario for every consumer. There are some people, and I'll pick maybe my father-in-law, who's no longer with us, but he was driven more so by risk than maybe a sibling of his, right? One of 5 children. And so leaving something behind versus spending all the money, for him, he was happy to sacrifice something in his retirement years for the sake of his family. Now, I think we've got to also account for that as a preference rather than a failing of the system, which I think sometimes is how we've spoken to about is, oh, we've failed to have someone spend all their money. So I think we just got to, I mean, this is the thing. How do you elicit someone's preferences if just purely a survey or a question and answer has proven to be not a reliable way of deducing those preferences? And
I and this is my soapbox. I had a real problem with risk profiles, and just for anyways listening, any advisor who seeks needs to know whether you're a conservative investor, a balanced investor, or an aggressive or growth type of investor. And a lot of advisors would just mail that out, email that out to client, fill that out, these say 10 questions and send it back. But if exactly as you said, and something similar we did, we would sit the client down, ask them to answer these 10 questions. And exactly one may of the question is, are you happy for a loss or a drop of 30% once every 10 years? Everyone, of course, says no. But if you actually then, once you've take those answers, and they may end up conservative or balanced investor, but once you actually say, let's just have 30 minutes of just going through this and explaining, yes, 1 in 10 years, a drop of the share market has been natural for the last 200 years, but it actually gives you a 2 to 3% better on average return than a balanced or a conservative. Which would you rather, as long as it's going to happen once every 10 years, and that's just normal for the share markets and property to react that way. Oh, okay, I get that. Let's now do this risk profile again, and they'll answer that question differently so that they'll end up mostly balanced or growth type of it, because I now understand. To give it to someone to answer questions when they don't know the topic is just madness, and yet that's a lot of what advisors do. We just, well, this is the compliance regime we're under. We have to do this. And I said, with a half an hour of just sitting down with the client as educators, you could do so much better. So it's great that you're doing that, and I can see where that fits in with this. Now, you also, what's interesting, it'd be great to get how you came to this, but you have 3 retirement pathways as part of this white paper. And we'll have a link to the white paper so anyone who wants to download, and it really is worth a read. And it's the 3 retirement pathways are certainty, balance, and flexibility. So can you just, how that works in practice, how you fit that with the average pre-retiree looking at retirement?
sure. Well, I mean, some of it is a little bit unsophisticated in terms of it comes back to what would be a good outcome for most people. And so you've got to have an anchoring or a starting position, and the balance profile is one where there's some degree of longevity protection, income protection, right? So the idea being that from a starting position today, where most arrive at retirement and leave money in their accumulation account by number, that's our starting position. So that's a problem. I would much rather see the system pay the money out and leave it to someone to determine whether they need to spend that money or not, like they would have with their working years with their wage. But I mean that. So I guess that's being forced upon the industry anyhow, with the retirement income covenant reaffirming that a fund's job is to provide an income in their members' retirement years. Again, it comes down to, so do we really need to know down to the cent what someone's income needs are? Or more importantly, even knowing that, there's a limit to what we can do about it in any case. We can't make money appear magically at someone's retirement age. So all you can do is, one, tell them that based on what we know about you, which often isn't a lot, so you're making some assumptions, for a defined period of time, this is the sort of income you can expect to have. And if some of that income was guaranteed, this is what that picture looks like. And then you've got the outliers, right? And in the paper, we limit the choice to 3. There's an argument to make that 5. And I think when we're looking to implement this work, which we're doing now with Challenger by developing some tools, some engagement tools for advisors to use with their clients, it's likely that we'll see the model evolve and have to evolve and be refined to make it work in practice. But the idea being that we don't start with this view of it could be between 1 and 100% of your money in an account-based pension or an annuity or a mix of, that there is a smaller number of choices we present, and those choices ideally pick up on some of those internal drivers that a consumer is likely to have, a client is likely to have. And it's it won't be news to any advisor like yourself and myself. Not all people are driven by maximum income. Some do a passionate view about preserving capital for some other purpose, next generation, what have you. And I think we're going to have room for that. But if the reason why someone isn't drawing an income or is sitting on the minimum amount is largely because we haven't told them to do more, and I think these are the easier fixes that are possible in the industry. It's not a lack of intellect or understanding of the problem. I think part of it is this uncertainty about any action we take might blow back on us. If someone sits in accumulation, what's the fault on a super fund? Where you could claim that, well, the members knows that they could draw an income. Well, it's on them. Whereas us leading them to start an income stream, put some of it into a longevity product, set their income amount at a certain amount, we're taking some risk on if we're pre-populating a picture. But I think that the marketplace is ripe now. There are some funds being led into taking more ownership on, and we're seeing that with not just products being made available, but importantly, ideally informed by this work. But yeah, they're starting to think about how those products interact with not just advice, but longer range, how they're talking about these things to 5-10 years out from a member's expected retirement age, so they don't just have this landed on their lap at the last possible moment.
Yeah, and I think you brought up a really good point there about where we can help someone who is thinking they're only taking the minimum when really they could take more, but their own behavioral biases may be, oh, I either need to leave this, I want to leave something for my kids, or I need to protect it if I live longer. That's where your advisor can absolutely help with these biases and say,
Spot on.
one, no, your money will last and we can do the numbers. And secondly, your kids will be fine.
Yeah.
I heard this great professor once say, spend kids' inheritance. So maybe not go that far, but
Yeah.
you need,
Yeah. There's that
worked hard.
guy with zero is another good one.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
You've worked hard. You need to enjoy this part of your life. And so you've got to just stop some of these biases and behaviors, and advisors in the industry can absolutely do so much more in helping their clients. So how have you actually found advice? I know this is a new white paper, but just this type of talking to advisors about this, are you getting sort of pushback or are they embracing it? What's your initial reaction from advisors in the profession?
Look, I would say probably there's a strong negative initial reaction to it. And again, entirely expected, in that if your approach to positioning retirement products is, oh, do you want an annuity? And you frame it as if you lose access to your capital in return for some fortnightly income. Like it's all in the positioning. So I think we do have a couple of the funds we work with that have a pretty good success rate with members taking up at least part of their income coming from an annuity. And it's because they don't leave it to their internal advice team to position at the last possible moment. They've seeded the idea that XYZ fund is here to pay you an income, and they start to normalize this thing of how much of your income will you want to have guaranteed. So it's not a matter of do you want it or not, it's how much of it. And that's subtle, but it's important because
Huge.
normalizing decision making is really important. And this is where a lot of the frameworks or the drivers that we reference in the paper, such as framing and bias, I mean, they can be used for good or evil. And I think that's the thing that we need to be really conscious of, is that there's enough clever people around that you could, if you spent your time on this, see members draw more in retirement, the take up of annuities increase. If it was the number one problem to solve, I'm sure we would. But you still got to have that view of, is it right? So you got to be confident enough with the models, the choices. If you limit choices, you are taking risk on. And I think that's absolutely the role for us to play. But in doing that, you do need to still account for, what's the same amongst almost every retiree, because there is a lot that people share in common versus what are the few differences that is worth accounting for. Just differences in balance and whether someone wants to golf or do more charity work. That they are differences, sure, but do they drive necessarily income and product decisions? Not in all cases. So I think that's the thing, that we don't need to conflate the differences that exist between one client and the next, one member and the next, but we need to account for them when they genuinely would or should be accounted for in the product mix decision.
Totally agree. And we're talking about behavioral bias by people who are retiring or pre-retirees of funds, or just everyday Australians, but there's a behavioral biases of advisors. So I understand the initial pushback, but it's just something that it is absolutely the way from someone
Yeah.
who now makes a living talking to retirees and consumer groups and all that. And I would always mentor advisors or speak to advisors. And if I asked advisors what would be the number three things that they would say every pre-retiree needs is, well, they want $1 million. They want to be able to travel the world. They want to pay off their mortgage. But if you actually drill down to what are their three real needs, it's actually, I want certainty of income. I absolutely want
Yep.
certainty of income. And I want to help my adult children get into their first home, and I want to be able to help my elderly parents. They're the actual behaviors. And so there's a disconnect between what advisors think their client needs to what actually the client actually needs. And all this is absolutely a help. So I really appreciate that, Adrian, because just keep on it, because I know advisors need it, because I know the consumers need it.
Look, what gives me confidence is, as I said, we've had that other piece of work on risk profiling, which we had to solve for the same challenges in terms of advisors had been accustomed to risk profiling being, in some cases, the start of your engagement process with a new client. And so it's not so much about risk profiling, is you've got to then have that advisor learn a new technique to otherwise build that necessary rapport that they might be using risk profiling for. So, I think what we saw was initially we led with the logic. This risk profile model, much better than what you're using. So we're going with that. And the first attempt to change the processes was met with a lot of resistance. Naturally, we did the thing we should have probably done from the outset, was to understand, well, we're worried about the consumer and their behavior and their mindset. We're also got to account for the advisor in this and their lack of relevance that some might be feeling. So I think we've landed really well with that. We did see with risk profiling, bias played a pretty significant role in terms of, whilst we didn't see wild differences, one member being defensive with our particular advice, but within a spectrum from conservative balanced growth, we did see enough of a bias to be concerned that if, a member that otherwise looked identical to the next one, they met with advisor A versus advisor B in the same fund, they would be recommended a different risk profile. And so what that's telling me is it's mostly about the interaction that's taking place, nothing to do with the question set we're giving them.
Yeah.
Whereas now with our new risk profile model, the member needs to go through a preference experience, and then the advisor uses the output of that for their product recommendation. And so we needed to make sure the advisor knew we're standing behind them. Like, we own the risk of this, whilst they've got an ethical and fiduciary obligation as an advisor. They won't be left on their own in terms of, you can rely on the output of that. But one of the things that really stood out with risk profiling, which I think applies to this work, is the obsession over the detail. So with risk profiling, we even removed the labels. Often you'll see defensive, conservative, balanced growth. That drives unexpected decisions or undesirables, because there'll be some people that don't want to be labeled as aggressive or growth, or vice versa, as conservative or defensive. But truly, when you look at the description, that's exactly who they are. So we removed those labels. We just have portfolio A to E, which we still has some bias issue with it, but we just wanted to only have in there words, phrases, iconography that supports a decision making process, and nothing more. And what we found was a lot can come out. And probably that goes for a lot of the advice process more broadly, is simplification is probably a theme we need to embark on if we're to try and reach that sort of scale that we're seeing we're going to need for the number of members set to retire over the next decade.
And yes, in that white paper, he says 2.5 million, because I think there's about 3 million now. So just in the next 10 years, it's going to nearly double. So
Yes.
we do need to get this right. And I remember one person telling me exactly what you're saying about how take away, whether it's aggressive or growth, how the reaction. Someone said, if you got into a lift and it either said soar or plummet, would you stay in there? Probably not, but it's still up and down. It's just the way you're framing it. So we really do need to be careful of the language we use, because it drives biases. Adrian, this has been really great. Thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure.
One of the things we always ask any guest on our show is, what's the very best piece of advice they've received, whether it's from family or a mentor or anything financial, otherwise? What would be the best piece you've received?
I'm pleased you asked me this question to think about beforehand, because again, as an advisor, you often think you've got all the best advice in your head and that you follow it. Well, no, in our household, my wife's our chief financial officer, and I tend to I'm susceptible making emotionally charged decisions. So the best bit of advice came from a mentor of mine. I was deliberating over a particular purchase, and not that he necessarily told me to do it or not, but he just said, think about, for smaller decisions, how will you feel 12 months from now about that decision? And for bigger ones, a decade or two. And what I think for me, what the profound part of that, ultimately it's just asking me a question. It wasn't even telling me what to do. But the thing that stood out for me is, whether it's buying a car, a home decision, partnering up, having a family, making a decision at that point in time based on the things that are in your head and your heart. We tend to use those mental shortcuts to help us make decisions. This back testing of how will you feel, how will you judge your own decision, you'll often know whether it's the right one for you or not. So I know that I love my cars. So spending money on car parts and servicing and what have you, I can reason with that. But as long as I'm doing it for the right reason, if I was making a decision purely because I wanted the perception of myself to be healthier or what have you, I know that decision wouldn't stand up in 12 months, 10 years from now. But if it's something that I truly believe in, it's a passion, then I'm likely to still feel good about that decision. So I think that's really important, because we often use in the superannuation industry standards, benchmarks. As for retirement standards one, there is a lot of power in that. Like, how are you going compared to the person next door, the colleague, in terms of your retirement savings, projected income? Those things are really useful. But the thing we just got to be a bit conscious of is what you value versus the next person might be very different. And we've got to account for that as well.
Great. Nice way to end. Adrian, appreciate your time. And this is really part A, because we'll talk to Challenger from the product in their part in this white paper. But just the best of luck. If you ever need any help helping teach advisors on what's really important to their clients, I'm always put my hand up. But just keep at it, because it is the right way to go. So best of luck with it all.
Beautiful. Thanks, Mark. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Adrian. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you'd like to know more about Adrian Gervasoni and IFS, visit www.ifs.net.au, or feel free to email me on admin@themoneysandwich.com, or visit our website, themoneysandwich.com, if you have any questions or would like to learn more. Enjoyed this episode and want to hear more of A Bite from the Money Sandwich? make sure you subscribe on your platform of choice so you can automatically receive each episode as soon as it's released. As with every podcast, this information is not advice, as not personalized to your own situation. And past performance is never guaranteed for the future. What we are trying to do here is to provide tips, coaching, and education to help improve your money knowledge, which we believe can only be a good thing. See you next time when we take another bite from the money sandwich.